Sunday, January 29th, 2023, on the edge of Yeoju along the river. We're at the gates of Shiloksa Temple. And this is an old temple that, according to legend, was founded by a saint during the Silla dynasty. Do you have any initial impressions of this temple we've been to many times?
Yeah, we've been here many times. Well, I think also there's a really old tree in there, like hundreds of years old. I don't remember exactly how old. And the temple is on the river, which I think is actually really special in Korea. It might actually be the only temple on a river.
I think it is.
Yeah, so that's it's one of its claims to fame, and it's just a really beautiful temple. We've been here on special occasions, or let's see, we came here for I think a New Year's Day or Christmas. I know for sure we were here on a Halloween.
Maybe twice on Halloween.
Yeah, it might have been for 2 years in a row we came on Halloween, right as the sun was setting, and it was really beautiful, but also kind of eerie because these candles were lit. It was kind of golden, glowing colors, and some lanterns were, floating in the wind. So
Sometimes they gong a giant brass bell as the sun goes down. And we've seen that once or twice.
yeah.
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 And then sometimes we've come and they just didn't do it. I don't know why, but
I think
it's
one
pretty
of
cool.
the most memorable times here was actually last year when it started snowing, and we were here, and we were up in the pine forest behind the temple, and all this snow was coming down through the pine trees, and the ground was covered in snow, and then this wind was coming from the east and just blowing this snow very strongly, and it was so cool to just walk there behind the temple in the snow. And there was some ice, and a few brave souls were out, but there weren't that many, so it was pretty cold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes we see bunnies hopping around the temple grounds.
Black bunnies.
I think there might be a couple other colors too, but they're not wild bunnies. They're definitely domesticated rabbits.
They're like temple bunnies with floppy ears.
Yeah, they just sit there. They're not scared. I don't think they have burrows to run to.
They're really plump too. They're cute.
They're plump and their fur is very soft. It does not look like camouflage fur like you see with wild bunnies. These are like fat domesticated bunnies that are
pure black
or pure white, and people walk up and take pictures of them.
Maybe they're lucky bunnies, temple bunnies.
Yeah, so there's an outer area which has a park complex with trees and walkways and benches, and of course exercise equipment, which is it's a very Korean thing.
Yeah.
You go to any park on top of a mountain.
Or public place, and they have these old-fashioned exercise machines.
But it's not for burning calories or
No.
building muscle. It's for stretching.
It's mostly for the older people. Yeah, they
Yeah.
come out and they use them to stretch and just get a little bit of cardio exercise in. But these machines are really old-fashioned, and you can't you can't really get too much of a workout on them. But
No.
they're everywhere.
You can kind of wiggle your belly while holding onto handles, and your foot, there's a platform for your feet that you can kind of shake from side to side. Mm-hmm. It's a little, I don't know, the old people love it, but I gotta say, it kind of clashes with the natural aesthetic of most parks. It looks kind of cluttered, like some junk in the corner. But I've used it, especially in the middle of the night, and it's kind of fun.
Yeah, but it's one of the ways you can see that health or wellness is just integrated into the culture. This is all over Korea. These little fitness stations exist, and then often they're next to a rocky pathway that you're supposed to take your shoes off and then you walk on. So it's like acupressure for your feet. And so this is something else that you'll see, especially the older Koreans during the summer doing. They'll be walking in the park on these little pathways. And I've tried it before, and some of them are super painful. The rocks really get in there. They're not all super smooth. Some of them are really sharp. Yeah. But then afterwards, you get this kind of head high from, I guess, all the endorphins or something. So afterwards, it feels kind of good. But during it, it's like that good pain. It's kind of painful during.
Yeah. Not here, though.
They don't have it here, though.
There's just some level concrete next to some trimmed grass.
Yeah, with bunnies.
With patches of snow, because it is January along the river. All right. So This is the outer park area. The inner park area is where they have the big bell and most of the buildings and everything. There are bathrooms and such all over.
And across the river, there's all of these motels and restaurants, and it's all lit up with neon. So,
And a lot of it looks like Christmas lights.
yeah.
And they do a pattern like I can almost imagine a windmill. Like Las Vegas style or miniature golf style.
So it's strange because we're out in the middle of nowhere. There's really nobody around. There's a river. The sky is pitch black, but then you look across this river and just like neon. It's like a mini little casino land or something. But like fluorescent lights are a thing here. Like there's so many. But even in the small towns, there's fluorescent lights everywhere.
Indeed. And in this small town, which is known for pottery and its delicious rice, and the river, it's also known for a couple other things, and I think that's why these buildings have all the lights. It's to make it seem more tourist fun. Like a tourist zone.
Okay, because tourists come here to see.
They come here to see the temple
and the pottery
and
well, they did.
There's the big one, which is King Sejong's temple.
Oh yeah.
And to a much lesser extent, Queen Min's house where she was born. I'm sorry, King Sejong's his tomb, not his temple, his tomb, and Queen Min's birth house. Same town, Yeoju, which is known for its geomantic powers. Mm-hmm. It's an energy nexus. Mm-hmm. So like I said, the temple was built during the Silla dynasty. If you don't know what a dynasty is, that's like a long period of one family ruling a kingdom. And a long time ago, in a land right here, there were 3 kingdoms on the Korean peninsula, and they fought each other for dominance, but one of them allied with China and took over. They were called the Silla dynasty. So they ruled for like 300 years, adopted their Chinese-style government with the bureaucracy and all that. They started bringing in... They started the tribute system with China, which was kind of nice. They would say, oh, we are subordinate to China. Here's some free stuff. And China would be like, that's cute. Here's some even better free stuff. So it was more like a trade thing, but as kind of a ceremony to show that Korea was subordinate. Mm-hmm. And that's when they started bringing in, when Buddhism started becoming even more widespread. And there was a hierarchy of temples for different social classes. So the super rich people would go to the nice temples. The poor people would go to the poor temples. And I don't know which one this was built for. I really don't. It looks nice. This temple complex has been renovated a few times. So there is some old stuff in it that's all run down. But they've got ancient Zelkova trees. And some more modern, cool temple-looking buildings with shrines inside and stuff. Anyway, during the Silla period, slavery becomes really widespread. About a third of the population becomes slaves. And you become and because Korea has such a stable history, there's not a lot of upheaval for slaves to take their chance to get out of Dodge. So they have the longest period of unbroken hereditary slavery of any country in the world.
What?
Yep.
What?
Yeah. And you become a slave through debt, or if you're on hard time, there's a famine or something, and you need food, you say, okay, me and all of my descendants, we're all becoming your slave. Just feed us, and so we don't die. And it's hard to get out once you're a slave. And yeah, so that's Unified Silla. Slavery, different temples for different classes, more Buddhism, more Chinese institutions. There's public and private slaves. Like rich people would have their slaves, and then the government would have their slaves to work to help with various offices and such.
Oh yeah, weren't you saying there were like school slaves?
Yeah,
or
there
something?
were schools, public schools. What few they had were staffed with slaves. I don't think the teachers were slaves, but assistants. They would have slaves attending to all the rich kids who didn't have to be working in the farms. You had to be rich to go to school because that's the only way you could have enough passive income to have the free time to study and learn to read and all that. So, Anyway, so that's Unified Silla, and that's when the temple was built. So it's around 668 was when the dynasty was formed. It lasted about a little less than 300 years, and for a while, for about a little over 200 years, the capital was Gyeongju. Do you remember us going to beautiful effing Gyeongju?
Yeah, that's where they have all the like is it UNESCO sites or
Yeah.
definitely like old. I think there was a huge old Buddha statue in a
There's a
cave or
giant temple
something.
complex, giant palace
Yeah, it
complex. A
was
lot of it
really
is
beautiful.
been destroyed and rebuilt, and there's whole parts of the city where they have fancy restaurants and such, all made with traditional Korean architecture, and it's gorgeous.
Yeah, even there's the old statues and carvings and buildings that you can go see, but then they also have the more modern stuff like little tea houses, and those are really beautiful too.
Gorgeous.
There were so many people there taking photos
Oh,
for
yeah.
Instagram and all of this
All
kind
the
of thing.
kids in Korea go here for their school trip.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
their field trip
What's one
is
of my
like
favorite places?
it is my favorite place as far as architecture.
There's
When I
so
was
much
there,
history
I was
there.
like, "Oh my God, why doesn't all of Korea copy this architecture?
Wow,
Korea would
yeah.
be gorgeous if they just had some kind of law, like all public buildings had to be in this style or something
The
like that.
traditional
Just
architecture.
traditional.
I
It's
love the traditional architecture.
gorgeous. Oh my God,
It'd be a different place.
yeah." But we went there for Buddha's birthday back a couple years ago when we were living in Daegu.
Unknowingly.
Unknowingly, and
Just
we
by chance.
we took a bus trip, because a lot of the places, the sites are so far apart. You can't get there without spending a bunch of money
Or having a
on like
car.
taxis. Or
Yeah,
having,
it's just
we
too
didn't have a
difficult.
car. We didn't want to spend money on taxis, so we bought
A day tour.
a bus trip,
Mm-hmm.
bus tour, and we got on the bus, and they were taking us around, and we were going on a long trip to various Buddhist places, and they told us over the intercom system on the bus, they said, it's Buddha's birthday, so none of you have to pay.
Yeah.
And I was like, yes,
Yeah.
magic.
Extra little treat.
Yeah. Then we went to an ancient Buddhist pagoda statue, and that's where I bought my ring, from a Buddhist temple.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ever see me in real life, and I've got this fancy spin ring, which as you turn the ring, I think it says Om Mani Padme Hum.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, the lotus, or the jewel and the lotus. And it's like a little prayer every time I move my ring, and plus it looks cool. So,
And you got it on Buddha's
and
birthday.
I got it on Buddha's
That's really
birthday, and I was like, wow, I haven't seen any trinkets in
It's a
Korea that
special ring.
really look cool. And that fortune teller was like, remember earlier in
Yeah,
Daegu,
yeah.
she was
Silver,
like,
wear
you need to get silver looking stuff. It doesn't have to be silver, but if it looks silver, you need to get a silver ring. And then I saw this thing on Buddha's birthday at the foot of this like 1200, or I think it was 1400-year-old Buddhist pagoda, and I was like, yeah,
You're like, that's it.
yeah, it doesn't cost much, and it looks pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice little souvenir. So I got it, and so that's our Gyeongju story. There's other amazing things there. But
Oh, yeah.
that's
That's the gist of it.
that's the gist of it. So we went to Gyeongju. We're at Shilloksa Temple here in Yeonju. Those are both made during Shilla. All right, so hierarchical society, slavery, temples, all that stuff. Moving on. I'm just going to give you a little walk through Korean history. I'll try not to make it boring, but it's kind of important that we pay our respects to the country that we've been living in by just acknowledging what this place is about, what made it. So, end of Unified Silla, it started to decay. There were palace coups, regional factionalism, people starting to remember out in the provinces, oh, there used to be an independent kingdom here. Maybe I could be the leader of the new independent kingdom. So, finally, there was a faction off in the provinces that took over during all this corruption and instability, and he went to the last Shilla king and said, hey, it's your time to die, buddy.
Ooh.
Well, I don't know if he said that, but you rather than die in battle, the last Shilla king's like, tell you what, I surrender, and you make me one of your subordinate royal court officials, make me an aristocrat along with my family and all their descendants, and a lot of the people who work for me will end up working for you. And the new guy was like, yeah, sounds good. Anyway, the guy who founded the dynasty, and this is where it's interesting, as he was dying, getting old, establishing his new Goryeo, where the word Korea comes from, as he was dying, he wrote his 10 injunctions, his rules for future kings.
Mm-hmm.
And these are basically the bylaws of his kingdom. And number 1, respect Buddhism. Number 2, use geomancy or feng shui
Oh, interesting.
for building temples, like
Okay.
Buddhist temples. The eldest son, my eldest son, is going to be king. For all future kings, it has to be the eldest son, unless he is unworthy.
Oh.
If he's unworthy, it's got to be the second son. And if he's unworthy, it's got to be the third, and so on. 4th rule, honor the Chinese. Do not follow the barbaric Khitans. Khitans were in the north, along kind of near Mongolia,
Yeah.
in Manchuria. They were like a horse, nomadic horse people. So he's like, copy the Chinese,
Okay.
honor them. Follow good geomancy. Number 5, visit Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea now. Visit there every 4 years because they've got good cosmic feng shui geomancy powers. 6, maintain state festivals. So uphold tradition, man. 7, follow the example of the Confucian sage kings of China. So be Confucian. 8, don't appoint to office men from Southeast Korea, the old Paekchu kingdom that he vanquished when he took over. So he's like discriminated against those people forever.
Wow.
At least in government. Like, I don't like them. They're not to be trusted. Number 9, be fair, treat the army well. Number 10, study the Confucian classics.
More Confucian.
So you can see he's like, my kingdom is going to be, we're going to study China. We're going to be Confucian, but with a lot of Buddhism in it too.
Mm-hmm.
So that he sets the tone for the next, how long? About 450 years? Yeah. So for the next 450 years, he establishes kind of a Buddhist code with lots of Buddhism. And he starts introducing the first civil service exam, testing.
Oh, no.
And we're both teachers, and we both hate testing because it
it's
rewards
tough
people
in
who
Korea.
can cram and then forget, and cram and then forget. And
Thus, where does the creativity go?
while
It
stamping
gets
out their
stamped out.
creativity. So you follow orders and dance on the head of a pin and on cue for an authority figure, and boom, you're ready to be
Get in the best college.
to go to the best college, and with more of that, you'll finally be a good obedient worker
Yeah.
for the business class
Yeah.
or government or whatever. But anyway, he starts the civil service exam. But to be honest, most people who he appoints who subsequent kings appoint to government get in there because they've got power in the regions, or because their dad took the test and therefore they're hereditary.
Okay.
They're like grandfathered in. They don't have to do it. So, but the exams, in any case, what few people can get into the exams, into the exam system, and be allowed in the government, that's only open to the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, well, if you study hard and you're poor, you
can't
get
rise
in.
from a peasant.
No.
Okay.
Not even really in theory. So this goes on. So the whole Confucian thing, where, being a learned gentleman with, an estate and memorizing all the Chinese classics, all that, you're in charge, you're at the top of the totem pole, and the military is considered kind of uncouth, kind of not worthy of, it's lowbrow.
Yeah.
So according to lore, nobody knows if this is true. I don't think there was a big party where Confucian people, like a barbecue, imagine, where all these Confucian gentlemen were hanging out, and one of them was such a dick to the admiral that he tied a firecracker to his goatee.
What?
Yeah. And it went up, and the guy was,
oh my gosh.
to show, he's like, yeah, haha, military are just a bunch of brutes.
Did his face
bunch
get
of
blown up? Oh my goodness.
half-wit brutes. We're the ones who actually read poetry and know about the world and are refined. And the military dude got pissed. And
What
so
happened?
he rallied his other lowbrow military brutes, and they overthrew them and said, yeah, you guys suck, or sick of taking it from you when we could kill you at any moment.
Oh my
So
God.
that's what we'll do. So they established a military dictatorship and used the kings as puppets from then on for 62 years. There's the Che military dictatorship. Only one thing. These brutes don't really know how to run a government. And so they kind of came crawling back to the Confucian scholars, and they're like, okay, please, can you, we're still the power behind the throne, but please, can you come back? So they ruled for a while, but then something happened. The Mongols took over China in the 1200s, and the Mongols said, all right, we're the bosses of China now. Give us way more tribute than the earlier Chinese ever demanded. And they tried to appease the Mongols for a while, and I think eventually one of their emissaries got killed, and the Mongols were like, okay, cool, now we have an excuse to invade you and just take what we want. So they invaded, and what they wanted more than anything were slaves. So they carted off 200,000 slaves during their rule of Korea. They ruled for about 130 years. So what they did, they forced the Korean kings to marry a Mongol princess.
Oh.
And then their half-blood child, son, half Mongol, half Korean, would be shipped off to Korea, or to China in Beijing, where he'd be raised, and he'd study until it's time for him to become king, and then he'd be able to go to Korea as king for the first time in his life. So it was kind of like a hostage system. And this went on for about 130 years, and finally the Mongols were overthrown in China by a massive uprising, and there's a new Ming dynasty that was established. In Korea, the puppet king, who was 127 parts Mongol out of 128.
Okay.
So he's like almost no Korean blood. He seized the opportunity. He stopped being a puppet and said, all right, we're going to drive you out. And he's like, we need to clean this place up. Let's appoint a Buddhist monk as prime minister. This very persuasive, clever guy named Shinton. And the prime minister, Buddhist monk, redistributes land. He frees a bunch of slaves. And his reforms eventually, well, they kind of pissed off rich people. So people were like, dude, the prime minister is a monk, a Buddhist monk. He's not a Confucian sage scholar. Who is this guy? Yeah. And the king, as much as we appreciate him driving out the Mongols finally, he's mostly ethnic Mongol. So let's kill them both. And they were both assassinated.
Really?
And that's the end of the reforms.
The monk was assassinated?
Yep.
Oh my gosh.
The monk was assassinated, and then the king. Despite all the nice things they did, they pissed off powerful people. Yeah. So that was the end of Mongol rule. All right. So there was a couple more kings towards the end of Goryeo. And the Goryeo dynasty, finally the king was like, okay, the new Ming dynasty in China, they claim control over part of a patch of land north of what is now Korea. And the Koreans said, well, before the Mongols took over, we controlled it. So there's a dispute. The king said, all right, I'm going to find a general who's going to go on a suicide mission and invade China and try to take this patch of land over. Completely insane. The general, like a good Confucian servant of the king, he agreed, and then he found an excuse later and said, you know what, China is technically our authority figure, and you can't go against authority figures. So I'm going to turn right around and overthrow the king of Korea.
Oh, no.
Yep.
Oh, no. Because you got to obey the higher authority, right?
Yeah. So He's like, to hell with this suicide mission.
Oh my God.
Let's go back, overthrow the king, and establish a new dynasty. The incoming dynasty became the last dynasty of Korea. That was the Joseon dynasty. And that was in 1392. And that dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, stayed in power for about 500 years.
Wow.
So, yeah. And this dynasty, unlike the Goryeo, which, we said was kind of mixed Confucian and Buddhist, the founding king said honor Buddhism. The new boys who took over the Joseon dynasty said, fuck Buddhism. They're a drain. There's a bunch of superstitious nonsense that's a drain on the government and the economy to support all their temples and all of their big nunneries and such. So what we're going to do is confiscate all of the Buddhist estates and lands and temples and libraries, and we're going to turn it all into Confucian academies.
Oh, I remember seeing some of these.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So all this beautiful Buddhist stuff, all the land, all the prime real estate, all of the slaves, they all became Confucian slaves instead of Buddhist slaves working to support all the Buddhist temples and
There were Buddhist slaves?
Yeah, there were Buddhist slaves. Yeah, the big Buddhist temples owned shitloads of slaves.
What?
Yeah,
Why
all
was there Buddhist?
maybe because of karma, they did something bad. I don't know. You'd have to ask them how they justified it. But yeah, so all their Buddhist slaves became Confucian slaves to support the Confucian academies, and they made the civil service more widely available to everyone. They said, all right, instead of having all these slave estates supporting Buddhist superstition, we're going to have all these slave estates available to create an educational system for the elite to help them become better rulers for the good of society. So to them, it seems like, it's a more progressive, a better idea. But all the Buddhists were driven out of the cities. And so that's why to this day in Korea, the Buddhist temples are in the mountains, in the countryside. Whereas if you go to Thailand, you see beautiful Buddhist temples in the city, in like downtown Bangkok.
Is that why?
Yeah, they're banned from the city. Yeah, it wasn't until later when the Japanese took over, when they started to allow the Buddhists to build in the cities. But it was the Confucians viewed the Buddhists as just a drag on the economy, a drag on...
Just taking too many resources.
Just taking too many resources and distracting from what really mattered to running an economy and a society. So that was the Joseon dynasty. Their best king, and that's why I bring up the Joseon dynasty, was Sejong. And he ruled in the 1400s, and this guy was a honest-to-God prodigy. I know it's easy to exaggerate what kings do, but this guy really was just brilliant at everything. So he invented the Korean alphabet. Before then, everyone had to learn Chinese, and they had to learn Chinese characters, and then they had a system for making Korean words with Chinese. It was incredibly complex and open only to the elite. He wanted more people to be able to read and write, so he invented Hangul, which is really easy and phonetic, and I can read it, and everyone uses that to this day. He commissioned research into medicine, how to manage farms. He updated timekeeping with calendars. He standardized weights and measurements. And I like this. He lightened punishments. So he wasn't into the cruelty. He's like, dude, we can't be just being brutal barbarians. Here's another thing he did. He, for government slaves, he said, female government slaves get maternity leave.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
You get 100 days of maternity leave.
That's awesome.
And later, the maternity leave was 30 days before you give birth too.
Oh.
And the husband gets 30 days of paternity leave.
Wow.
When the kid is born.
I had no idea.
Yeah, he's a straight G. Brilliant guy.
So he's the one who's buried in our town.
Yeah,
Like, we live in Yeoju, and Yeoju's known for this tomb of King Sejong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Daewang Sejong, great king. and they picked this town because of the magical feng shui, all the energetic properties of the landscape. Put him here. So we've been to his tomb a few times.
Yeah, 2 or 3 times.
And the first time we went was a couple years ago, and that was on Hangul Day. There's an actual holiday celebrating the proclamation of the invention of Hangul, the alphabet. The Korean alphabet. So I was like, okay, we got to go and pay our respects to the great king on Hangul Day. So we went, and the taxi took us not to the front of the place. He was following his little geo coordinates on his monitor that he has.
Yeah, he basically dropped us off at the back gate that was locked, and it was like maybe the entrance for like the security guard or the groundskeeper. And so we were just dropped off kind of in the middle of nowhere. We were like, okay.
Yeah, and the
sun
was setting, and I was
setting.
Like, they're gonna close this place. We gotta get. And so, and
I think our maps on our phone wasn't working very well. The internet connection was kind of shoddy, so we were just kind of like stuck in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of this big tomb.
Not just a big tomb, but a giant tomb grounds.
Yeah, like a big park.
Different buildings and parks, all designed for feng shui, with ponds and such. And I was like, oh man, we're not going to get in. Should we hop the fence, or should we just
start walking
or something? And then this guy comes up in a long coat, and with his lady, and they look like a couple of gentlemen, and he looked like he owned the place. And he came up and was just like, and he pulled out, was it like a key?
Yeah, something.
Like a key card, and he was like, oh, don't worry. And he opened the gate.
Yeah, it was so magical. We were like, where did this guy come from?
Right then, it wasn't because of us that he came out.
He happened to be coming
just happened to be coming in at that time through this back road at the edge of all these little village homes, and he opened the gate for us, and we went in, and he kind of went his own way, and we said thank you. And I swear I know that, like, I thought some of Sejong's descendants lived in the area, and I was wondering, like, does this guy get some kind of, is he a descendant of the king?
I don't know.
Being like, come on in, it's cool, I'm.
Well, and we ended up getting in, and then we found out there were like nobody on the grounds. We were some of the only ones, because there was this in front of one of the old Korean buildings, there was this choir, or like there's these people playing the ancient Korean instruments, and they were being filmed, and it was being broadcast live on television. So it was like this big celebration in Korea, and we somehow got onto these grounds, and nobody really else was on the grounds.
They had television crews and a big projection set up on this big stage in front of the big complex with all these chairs set up, and the guy who let us in was headed towards all that, and I think maybe the president was going to be there.
I don't know, but
and a bunch of
it was a big deal.
It was a big deal,
and then the guy let us in.
So I was like, okay, before they throw us out or tell us let's get to the tomb. So we went straight for the tomb, and we had to go through all these winding trails and everything, and it's a beautiful place. Every time we go there, it's like right as the sun is setting, and we have to kind of rush it. But we went to his tomb, and we went all the way up there, and I was like, oh man, I gotta.
And there's these special pathways you walk on to go to the tomb. You go through like this little gate, and then it's like a special walkway that leads you to the tomb.
It's
like a stone pathway.
Flagstone.
Yeah.
And there's two. There's the stone path, and then the one next to it. One of them is for like the king, and one of it is for everyone else, I think. So I walked on the king's path, man, because that's how I am. And the whole time I was like, Sejong, if you're listening, give me the power to accept the responsibility of being king, or just power in general.
Did you get with it?
Yeah, and it was an interesting mental exercise. So we make it to the front of the shrine, and then a little golf cart comes up, and there's a security guard, and he's like, oh, what are you doing? Like, in Korean, of course, and we're like, oh, we're paying our respects to the great king.
But we also kind of look like hapless tourists. Yeah. So I think he felt a little bad for us.
Well, I think he was kind of charmed that we would even care.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was.
And like we were paying our respects and like bowing and stuff. And
so I think he gave us he was like 5 or 10 more minutes. He was like, okay. He was like, just get out.
Take your time,
minutes.
But you have to leave when you're done paying your respects. And he drove off. And I was kind of charmed by that.
Yeah.
So eventually we left as it got darker and darker, and we left
Through the front gate.
Through the front
And we were
gate.
able to get a cab
and
to
we
get
were able
home.
to get a cab to get home, and that was a pretty magical Hangul-dae Sejong tomb here in Yeoju experience.
Yeah.
Beautiful place. That was their best king. They've had a couple bad kings too. One was Young Sangun, which was, I think, 25 years later, maybe a little. He was born 26 years after Sejong died. This guy went insane, kidnapped women from all across Korea to serve as palace entertainers. He did bloody purges, killed people, went crazy, and I think finally he was exiled to an island.
Yeah, there was some bloody history also.
There's one palace called the Cheongdeokgung Palace that we went to in Seoul on Halloween. Yeah. And not last Halloween, but the 2021 Halloween, I was like, dude, I want some magic. I'm not just going to stay home for Halloween. Give me some magic. So we were like, okay, ghost tour in Seoul.
And this, by the way, was our first event with any people since the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah. So it was like the first time out with other people. So it was a big deal.
Felt a little weird.
It felt a little weird.
So we met and we went to all these supposedly haunted places. And sure enough, my wish for magic came true, and all these storm clouds started rolling in like thunder and lightning. Yeah. The moment the tour started.
To the dot. Like the minute we started moving and the guide started talking, it was like thunder and lightning.
It's like an American Korea scholar who did this as kind of a side project. And he would go up to the gates of various buildings. The first one, he was like, all right, so here's the place where 100 people were all killed. And then lightning. I was like, holy shit, this is perfect. If this was in a movie, I wouldn't believe it. I'd be like, that's over the top.
The thunder sounds were like right on cue. God. And then the whole crowd is laughing because oh my God, it was like it had been scripted.
Man,
but it was all,
if I were him, I would have played it up and would have been like, this is where they had a great cleansing and their spirits demand sacrifice.
And then
But he was describing some pretty gruesome shit with blood running through the streets.
Was
and
there a crazy prince or something?
Yeah, there was.
Oh my God.
We went to the palace, the Cheongdeokgung Palace, and on the internet they don't really talk about the weird shit that happened there. Yeah, but he went into detail, and he's like, yeah, people don't really come here that much.
It feels eerie.
And it feels eerie. He's like, when they built this, I think they rebuilt it by Gwanghaegun, I believe. Yeah, it's an old palace, but then they kept rebuilding it because it was damaged and such. But rebuilt by this guy, and they didn't use traditional feng shui principles when they built the inside of it. They kind of used a different technique. So he's like, yeah, there's kind of a funky flow to where the buildings are placed. It's not quite traditional. And I don't remember all the story, but I remember that a lot of people, royal people who would stay there would say, like, yeah, we can't really stay here because of all the ghosts.
Yes.
Queen Min, who was born here, when she was queen, she would stay at the palace and say, yeah, I can't sleep here because the ghosts make too much noise. Yeah. I believe there were
and I think there were people that were killed or something really bad happened.
Relatives of the king who were like half brothers and stuff who were killed because they posed a challenge, that kind of thing. But I wish I could find the details online. But the tour guide said, people don't really talk about this one very much. It's not on a lot of tourist maps, and so you're not going to find a ton of information online. It's kind of embarrassing to some people, but it's pretty well preserved. And right next to it is a giant Japanese bunker, which is too expensive to tear down. And it's mostly, it's not above ground. There's an entrance next to it that goes underground. And he's like, yeah, that's one of the best preserved Japanese bunkers from World War II in the country. It's right next to this weird haunted palace. And not a lot of lights are on. And he said ghosts will come and if you walk around at night, I thought there was something about boyfriend girlfriend. Like if you go there with with a spouse or a partner, romantic partner, that the ghost will try to interfere with that or something.
I don't know. I just wanted to get out of there. It felt
I wanted to go back and be like, dude, we gotta come back here with pizza and soju and wait for ghosts. That'd be awesome. That'd be a fun little ghost story. I need a peak experience, even if it's frightening. I just want it to be like impressed in my mind. But Shamar was adamantly against it.
Well, and it's weird because this palace is in the middle of Seoul, so it's in a really big, busy city. But then once you go past the main gate, it's like there's not a lot of lights, and it's just this dark land, and you kind of suddenly feel like you're out in the countryside. It just feels really eerie to be, and it's like kind of a massive building, and it just, I don't know, it's like going down a dark alleyway or something. It just feels scary.
Yeah, I couldn't see any ghosts, so I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But it did feel really fucking eerie.
Yeah.
And I love how it's dark and there aren't lampposts everywhere, the big electric signs. Like, even if it's scary, it's just a place where I could kind of breathe in the city. I love that. But it was raining off and on by that point, and there was lightning and all that.
Yeah.
And the lightning was starting to peter out by that point. The end of the trip.
What was the story he told us about the prince and like something about like being locked in a chest or something? Do you remember
one of the princes was insane. He was a bipolar murderer rapist who would just like murder and rape people, and the king isn't supposed to get his hands dirty with killing royal people. So
what do you do if that's like your
it was, and there's no way that this guy could have power because he was just off his rocker, and not just off his rocker in a benign way, but in a very violent, mean kind of way.
Yeah.
So I believe royal family members, you're not supposed to draw blood. So rather than chop off his head or something like that, they had to lock him in a rice box where he suffocated.
Oh, he did die.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that wasn't the guy who built the palace that we visited. This is just another one of the another example of some of the insane people who come to power or come close to power.
Yeah, and these stories that we heard on Halloween night.
Yeah, pretty cool. So that's the Joseon dynasty. Confucian is at the top of their game. It's the high point of classical Korean culture. And again, a third of the population are slaves, but that starts to dwindle by the 1900s. I think it became the number lowered to 1.8%, if I remember correctly, by the 19th century, because it became more profitable to just employ free laborers rather than have some guy stuck on an estate with his own plot of land that he uses. I believe he would spend, the privately owned slaves would work the farms for their master, and they'd have their own plot too to survive. And if you're bound to an estate, it's a little hard to do projects wherever business pops up. So it became cheaper to just let them go. And yeah, so the system started breaking down in the 1800s, the 19th century. And am I forgetting something? Oh yeah. Before then, there was the Japanese invasions, which were some of the largest seaborne invasion in history. Let's backtrack a little. Late 1592 to 1598, there's the Imjin War, where something like 20% of the population was killed or carted off to Japan as slaves. And 300,000 people were invaded this place. Japan had unified, I think in part thanks to the introduction of firearms from Portugal. So that had a ripple effect. They said, okay, let's march into China through Korea. So they devastated Korean society in the late 1500s and everything was burnt to the ground. But the Buddhists got to prove themselves. Some of the people who resisted the Japanese the most were these mountain men, Buddhist monks who were exiled to the mountains, where there were tough guys who would defend their temples from tigers and robbers and such. And so they formed what are called righteous armies. the Buddhists and a lot of the peasants, and they're spontaneous militias who would fight the Japanese. So yeah, that was. I'm bringing this up because a lot of times the students will say, "Oh, Korea is the most invaded place in the world," and that's not true. That's only true if you count every little like pirate raid. But then, if you counted that as an invasion, then other countries could also claim that they were invaded so many times. But the big invasions in Korean history were the Imjin War in the late 1500s, the massive, devastating Japanese invasion, and the earlier Mongol invasion that we talked about. Anyway, Korea rebuilt itself in the 1600s and eventually fell into decay as a closed hermit kingdom in the 1900s. And finally, it was becoming obvious that the rest of the world was way more technologically advanced, way more modern, way more prosperous than Korea. And the Japanese started to encroach on Korea. And one guy came to power. He put his nephew on the throne because he thought he was young and easy to push around. And they found some distant royal woman to be his wife, who became queen. Her name is Queen Min. And she was born here in Yeoju. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the most romantic tales ever, as the Japanese were encroaching, sending spies everywhere, doing assassinations, trying to manipulate the place, manipulate the government and all that. The Korean government, the imperial government, had to decide, how do we modernize without the entire system breaking down? And so they started introducing technology, letting different countries modernize different parts of the country, but not totally opening the place up. And the Japanese were supporting different factions through bribery and such. And Queen Min knew what the Japanese were up to. So she was very cautious, pushing them away. And she would just read constantly. And she was the ruler of the country de facto, whereas her husband used to just drink booze and gamble and hang out with his concubines. So he was a playboy, while Queen Min was the real deal. But over time, they started growing closer to each other, and he started realizing like how much he loved Queen Min, who was really running the show and knew what she was doing. And eventually, the Japanese knew she was the biggest obstacle to them taking over, so they broke into her palace and had her killed. And the king was so distraught. He was just so heartbroken, he would just sign anything that the Japanese gave him. And he basically handed over more and more chunks of the country to Japan. And yeah, it was heartbroken. He signed away Korea, basically. Finally.
Yeah, and I was reading about that the first time the Japanese tried to kill her, she had one of her, I think, ladies in waiting dressed up as her. So when the Japanese came in, they thought that was the queen, but she had already escaped. So they ended up killing the lady in waiting that looked like the queen. Yeah. So then they had to try again. The next time they came back, they ended up killing the queen and all of the ladies in waiting, almost as well, we'll get back at you for that. And then I think there was like a big burning or something. So yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah, we tried to go to Queen Min's house on her birthday when we first came to Yeoju, and it was closed. We're like, what? It's in the middle of the day. It's what's going on?
Coronavirus was happening. So
yeah, maybe. But there were other places that were open.
Yeah, we never figured out what's closed.
Yeah, this was before the bigger restrictions a couple months later. But whatever, we tried. Maybe we'll try again. And so Queen Min, true patriot, but killed by the Japanese. The country gets slowly, Japanese get more and more intrusive in the government with their spies and stuff. Finally, there is a peasant rebellion, the Donghak Peasant Rebellion, 1894 to 1895. And there's a massive peasant rebellion that challenged the government. and they were about to lose control to these. Some of them are rebellious slaves. A lot of them were just dirt poor peasants, probably with some warlords thrown in, trying to overthrow the government because they were miserable and the government just couldn't reform fast enough. And the Korean government said, oh shit, we're going to lose our government to this ragtag massive rebellion of poor people. So they invited in the Chinese to help put it down. And Japan said, you told us you'd never invite China into the peninsula. We feel threatened. So they used that as an excuse to invade and push out the Chinese. And after that point, the Japanese were pretty much in control. They whipped China bad, and they told the Koreans, yeah, your classical tribute system where, you consider yourself subordinate to the ancient Confucian homeland of China and you exchange tributes with them. We're going to break that system to weaken China, our arch rivals. So we're going to call you the Korean Empire from now on rather than a kingdom. So you're less subordinate to China. That lasted until 1910, and then Japan finally said, you know what, let's just stop pretending. You're formally annexed, and you are now property of Japan. And that lasted till the end of World War II, and that leads us to the modern day, which we'll have to wait for another time.
Okay.
Yeah.
It'll be next one.
Yeah. All right. So anything else? Any reflections on ancient Korean history and how it informs the present? Maybe the examination system? Maybe what?
Oh, actually, I gotta say it's super cold out here, and like my brain, my brain is being pulled down to my toes because they're freezing.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question. Okay, how does it relate to today? Anything?
Well, does anything come up in your mind? All I can say is that the architecture from the pre-modern period is gorgeous, and it should be everywhere.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Yeah. And
well, I mean, you definitely see how Confucianism is still definitely here, and the hierarchies remain, and academics is so important, and the testing system is still very important.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and paying respects to your elders and also ancestors. I mean, that's still very much a part of the culture.
Some academics say that the Korean system of government in the pre-modern period was so stable that their dynasties tended to last like double or maybe a little less than double the average length of dynasties in other countries. So a ruling family would stay in power for twice as long as like they would in Egypt or England or other places. So, but what's interesting to me is how stable it was, and you read about the decay in the 19th century with all the corruption and palace intrigue and backstabbing and factionalism. It seems like the system was so perfect in its conservatism and keeping everything in place with the unbroken hereditary slavery and the caste system of people being bound to estates, that it wasn't flexible enough to modernize quickly, and that's kind of what led to its downfall. It was too perfect in its conservatism.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's both its superpower in that it's ultra stable, and also its central deficiency. You have to adapt to a changing world. You can't wish it away. So a lot of people wanted to reform earlier in the 19th century, a lot of Confucian scholars who read about the outside world, and they were either sidelined or murdered or tortured or just told to renounce their own writings. And yeah, it happened. You can read about it. It's interesting. Some of them were proposing. There's one guy who was influenced by, I think, Catholic teaching, and he proposed a way of village life that was basically anarcho-syndicalism. It's interesting. but he was forced to renounce his beliefs and sideline. So it refused to bend, so it broke.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting fact. Can you hold this while I take off my glove to conclude our podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind 1,500-year
That's
trip through history.
Yeah.
Hopefully interesting enough with our own personal anecdotes.
Maybe the next one we'll get to the more modern history, because that's very interesting too.
That's why I wanted to cram
so
all the
much.
ancient stuff in one and then get to the juicy stuff, which is North Korea and South Korea.
Oh yeah, that's
So anyway, it's Sunday, January 29th, 2023. We're on the edge of the river in Yeoju.
in the cold. My toes are cold.
In the cold, there's patches
the
of
river.
snow and no bunnies.
We got,
But
we got our hats and our coats and our gloves, and we're all huddled up by the river.
yeah,
So
underneath
by
these
the temple.
underneath these nice, interesting classical architecture lampposts.
Yeah, we got to get walking again so we get the blood moving.
Anyway, January 29th, Sunday, 2023, on the banks of the river in beautiful Yeoju, South Korea. See you next time.
Bye.